The air in hell didn't burn. It choked. It was a particulate broth of ash, despair, and the iron-rich scent of freshly spilled blood. It's forever caught in a state of being breathed in and screamed out. The sky, a permanent bruise of ochre and slate, pulsed with a sickly inner light, casting no shadows but instead leaching color from everything beneath it. Into this atmosphere, souls were not so much born as forged. One moment, there was the abstract terror of falling. The next, a violent, wet cohesion as consciousness slammed into a new, agonizingly solid form. This was the Crucible, a vast, broken plain of jagged black basalt, where the newly arrived writhed and shrieked in a chorus of pure, undiluted horror. Among them was a soul who had, in life, been called Alistair. Now, he was only a raw nexus of memory and pain. He lay on the sharp stone, naked and vulnerable, his form still shimmering with the last echoes of mortality. The memories were the first assault. Every betrayal he'd enacted, every cruel word, every act of cold. Calculated greed played back not as recollection, but as sensation inflicted upon him from the inside. He felt the sting of the tears he'd caused, the ache of the hearts he'd crushed, phantom cold of the kindness he'd withheld. Then came the external shaping. The ground itself seemed to writhe, its thin, razor-edged filaments of obsidian, heated from some infernal depth, snaked up from cracks in the rock. They did not grab, but insinuated. With a sound like tearing parchment, they found the softness of his spirit form. One filament coiled around his wrist, not to bind, but to carve. It pulsed with corrosive heat, burning a searing band of ownership into his essence. Another traced a path up his ribs, branding not just pain but a ledger of his sins into his very being. This was not punishment with a purpose yet. This was the initial stamp, the raw branding of damnation, reducing a complex human evil to a quantifiable, marked asset. His screams joined the cacophony, a symphony of fresh torment that was the primary music of the Crucible. They did not scream alone. Through the haze of his own agony, Alistair perceived the facilitators of this chaos. They were not the grand winged devils of Scripture. These were the working class of damnation, the reclaimers. Bipedal, but hunched and muscular, their skin was the texture of cured leather stretched over furnace coals. Their faces were elongated, devoid of anything resembling empathy. All sharp teeth and eyes that reflected the suffering they curated like dark jewels. They moved through the field of fresh souls with a brutal, efficient economy. One reclaimer nearby paused over a soul who had been a violent man. With a clawed hand that dripped a viscous smoking fluid, it reached into the soul's shrieking mouth and pulled, not on tongue, but on something ethereal and bright. The remnant of a stolen life force. The soul's screams turned into silent, gaping convulsions as its form grew dimmer. The reclaimer deposited the glimmering essence into a hooked canister at its hip, a raw material harvested. Another reclaimer efficiently solved a logistical issue. Soul, maddened by pain, had managed to crawl a few yards. With a detached swing of a barbed, bone-like tool, the demon shattered the soul's knee. A spray of ectoplasmic fluid, glowing with a faint dying light, arced through the air. The demon didn't pause, simply moving on, leaving the soul to drag its ruined form over the glass-sharp stone, spreading its own essence in a slick, suffering trail. This was the truth of arrival. This was the processing plant. The dramatic fires and personalized tortures would come later, in departments and divisions. Here in the Crucible, it was pure, industrialized breakdown. Souls were logged by their pain, sorted by the volume of their screams, and prepared for distribution. The blood here was not the deep red of humanity, but a spectrum of infernal hues. Luminescent gold for stolen grace, oily black for nurtured hatred, a sickly silver for poisoned love, each spill a resource to be collected, each cry a unit of energy to be measured. As the initial soul-rending branding subsided into a deep, throbbing ache, Alistair's newly demonic senses began to attune. The cacophony resolved into patterns. He heard not just screams, but the guttural, clicking language of the reclaimers, calling out tallies and conditions. He saw, through the smoky air, the edges of the Crucible were larger. More organized shapes, less bestial, more bureaucratic, weighted with ledgers and chains. The raw, bloody forging was complete. The product, a categorized and branded sinner, was ready for the next stage. The raw, bloody forging was complete. The pain did not end. It simply became the base temperature of existence. As a chain, cold and heavy with the weight of profound indifference, was clapped around his neck by a silent, robed figure, Alistair understood one thing. This was not a pit of random fury. This was a system. And his file, still dripping with his essence, was now ready to be processed. The chain around Alistair's neck did not lead to a dungeon, but to a desk. The jagged basalt of the crucible gave way to a vast, cavernous complex that stretched into a soot-choked infinity. This was the Asphodel Ministry, the administrative heart of damnation. Here, the raw, screaming agony of arrival was processed, quantified, and filed. The air, still thick with the scent of blood and ozone, now carried the acidic temps of ink and the dry rot of parchment. The drama here was not of explosive violence, but of meticulous, soul-crushing procedure. Alistair, along with a shuffling line of other newly branded souls, was led by a silent, robed dretch, a low-level functionary whose face was little more than a bureaucratic blur. The sounds were a hellish symphony of bureaucracy, the relentless scratch of quills on infernal vellum, the wet thud of stamps being applied to flesh, the low, constant murmur of demonic clerks reciting codes and statutes. Their first stop was the Hall of Assessment. Souls were not judged here. That had already occurred. They were catalogued. Alistair was shoved before a towering, multi-armed demon perched behind a bench of petrified wood. It did not look at him, but at the glowing runic brand still sizzling on his chest. One arm, ending in a bony stylus, jabbed the brand. Alistair convulsed as fresh pain, sharp and clinical, lanced through him. The stylus extracted a thread of his essence, a shimmering silver strand tainted with the gray of calculated greed, and fed it into a complex brass device on the desk. Gears clanked. A small, teeth-lined maw at the device's side spat out a long scroll of skin-like parchment. This was his damnation ledger. Every sin now rendered as an itemized list. Page 14, line 3. Embezzlement of trust. 12,000 units of anguish allocated. Page 22, line 45. Emotional neglect chronic. 450 units of sorrow per diem. Compounding. The bureaucratic demon used another arm to press a hot, intricate seal onto Alistair's shoulder, marking him with his new identity. Soul designate 8897 Delta, Department of Avaricious Torments, Subdivision, Betrayal of Kinship. Blood was a currency here, but it was spilled with paperwork. In a nearby alcove, a soul who protested its categorization was being refiled. A clerk, the sigh of profound annoyance, summoned a reclaimer guard. The guard's implement was not a brutal club, but a precise, heated blade. Without ceremony, it began to carefully flay the protesting soul's designated sinsigil from its chest, removing the incorrect brand. The soul's shrieks reached a fever pitch as the bureaucratic error was literally carved away, only for a fresh correct sigil to be seared into the raw. Glistening essence beneath, the spilled ectoplasm, a vibrant indigo signifying pride, was neatly caught in a calibrated vial held by an imp assistant, who scurried off to the appropriate resource ledger. Alistair's line moved forward to the Department of Manifestation. Here, the theoretical punishments of the ledger were made physically real. A gaunt, scholarly demon with lenses over its many eyes studied Alistair's file. It clicked its tongue, selected a long needle from a rack, and dipped it into a bubbling crucible filled with a substance that looked like molten regret. With a swift, practiced motion, it plunged the needle into Alistair's spirit form, not in a vital spot, but in a nexus of metaphysical nerves. The effect was instant and internal. Alistair's senses were flooded not with external fire, but with the inescapable, visceral sensation of every financial loss he had ever caused others. He felt the cold dread of an emptied bank account, the gnawing hunger of a child he'd rendered penniless, the desperate sweat of a ruined partner, all as if they were his own experiences. This was his foundational torment, downloaded into his being. He collapsed, gagging on phantom deprivation. As a clerk stamped his file, manifestation complete. The final stage was assignment. He was dragged, still trembling from the internal assault, to a vast circular chamber riddled with countless tunnels, each pulsing with a different shade of suffering. A dispatcher, a demon whose head was a swirling vortex of ticker tape and tiny shrieking faces, consulted a massive, ever-scrolling ledger. It cross-referenced Alistair's codes with department quotas, sync compatibility matrices, and torment optimization schedules. "Waste not," the dispatcher muttered, its voice the sound of grinding gears. It plucked a shimmering, hooked key from its belt. The key was made of crystallized pain. Without warning, it stabbed the key into Alistair's branded chest, where it melted in, becoming a cold, permanent weight. A ticket, glowing with infernal script, ejected from a slot in the dispatcher's desk. An imp snatched it and slapped it onto Alistair's forehead. 2. Avernus Financial Tortures, floor 6666, Cubicle Farm Delta. Report to Overseer Malachor daily. Quota: 18 liters of agonized remorse. Failure is not an option. Remember, your suffering fuels the machine. The robed dretch returned, yanked the chain, and pulled Alistair toward a tunnel that smelled of cold copper and desperate tears. Behind him, the great machinery of the ministry clattered on, processing an endless queue of the damned. The drama of individual suffering was irrelevant here. It had been reduced to codes, quotas, and efficiencies. The blood had been spilled, measured, and logged. Alistair was no longer a soul, or even a victim. He was an employee, a numbered asset, and his eternal shift was about to begin. The true grind awaited. The tunnel from the ministry disgorged Alistair, now soul designate 8897 Delta, into the vast fluorescent-lit cavern of Avernus Financial Tortures. Floor 6666. The air here was sterile and recycled, humming with the low-grade misery of forced productivity and the faint, coppery scent of expended spirit. It was a cubicle farm stretched to the horizons of damnation, each partition a stained fibrous material that seemed to absorb whimpers. This was the grind. Not the dramatic operatic tortures of myth, but the soul-crushing, repetitive administration of anguish. Alistair's cubicle was a 3x3 cell containing a chair of living nerve tissue that squirmed unpleasantly, and a desk fused to a complex brass mechanism. Embedded in the desk's surface was a smooth obsidian pane. As he sat, the hooked key in his chest flared with icy fire, and the pane lit up. A face appeared on the screen, not a recording, but a living damned soul from another department, its expression frozen in a rictus of financial panic. Alistair's task was not to scream or be whipped, it was to talk, to explain, in meticulous, unassailable logic, the compound interest of betrayal, the diminishing returns of love misspent, the total, irrevocable bankruptcy of their moral standing. His words, channeled through the infernal device, became psychic scalpels. He watched, helpless to stop his own mouth, as his calibrated whispers made the soul on the screen relive, in hyperreal detail, the moment they chose greed over mercy, profit over person. The soul's silent scream on the pane would end with a psychic pop, and a viscous amber droplet, pure, refined remorse, would drip from a spigot on Alistair's machine into a waiting cylindrical flask. His quota, as stamped on his essence, was 18 liters. Around him, the cavern echoed with the soft, terrible industry of his co-workers. The rustle of infernal scrolls, the steady plink-plink-plink of remorse droplets hitting glass, the occasional wet, shuddering sigh as a soul demon like himself briefly broke under the meta-torment of inflicting torment. A demon one row over, tasked with administering existential dread to failed artists, simply put its head down on its desk and began to dissolve into a puddle of gray goop, its essence unable to sustain the contradiction. A swift cleanup crew of imps scuttled in, collected the goop with squeegees into a biohazard barrel, and a replacement was chained to the cubicle before the stain had even dried. The blood here was in the details, a slow psychic hemorrhage of the victims on the panes, the self-inflicted wounds of the damned laborers, a chewed-through, lip-dripping ichor onto a report, a claw nervously picking at a branded sigil until it wept sluggish black fluid. Overseer Malachor, a bloated demon with a vestigial second mouth, constantly whispering productivity metrics, patrolled the aisles. Its presence was a pressure change, a tightening of the air. It carried no whip, only a thin, silver probe. When it stopped behind a demon whose flask was filling too slowly, it would simply lean in and insert the probe into the worker's ear. The demon would seize, eyes rolling back as Malachor manually downloaded a surge of their own most potent personal shame to jumpstart their output. The victim would then work at a frenzied weeping pace. Their fluids now a mix of amber remorse and the streaky red of their own degrading sanity. Alistair's own flask filled with agonizing slowness. Each droplet extracted was a piece of his own remembered humanity scoured away. The face on his pain, a woman who had stolen from a widow's pension, began to cry tears of liquid silver. Her pain was genuine, potent. But Alistair felt nothing. That was the real horror, the core of the grind. The system didn't just harvest suffering from its clients, it drained the capacity to care from its workers. He was becoming an empty, efficient mechanism. The end of his shift was signaled not by a chime, but by a sudden suction from the flask. A tube snapped onto it, draining the collected remorse into the gullet of the floor's central piping. His key cooled. The pain went dark, but the work was not done. He was herded with the rest of his shift to a gray nutrient paste dispenser, then to a barracks, a shelf-like niche in a damp wall. As he lay in the niche, the squirming chair's echoes still in his bones, stared at the cavern ceiling far above. Crisscrossed with pipes carrying the day's harvest was a cog smoothed down by eternal repetition. The drama was gone, burned away by the fluorescent hell of routine. There was only the quota, the empty remorse, and the slow. Certain knowledge that tomorrow would be exactly the same, and the day after, for eternity. Yet, deep in the hollowed-out place where his soul had been, a tiny, stubborn shard remained. Not of goodness, but of self. It recoiled at the paste, flinched at the echo of Malachor's whisper, and felt anew. Alien emotion regarding the amber droplets. Not numbness, but resentment. It was a quiet, dangerous spark, the kind that, in a realm powered by flammable suffering, could be more volatile than any scream. But for now, it was just a faint heat in the cold machinery of the grind. Tomorrow's quota awaited. The product of the grind did not vanish into the pipes. It flowed downwards, a vast, pulsating river of harvested agony converging in the foundries of perdition. A deeper, hotter layer where the raw suffering of hell was refined into its pure, usable forms. This was the engine room of damnation, the industrial heart that powered the infernal bureaucracy above. Alistair, along with a work gang of other cubicles damned, was yanked from his niche for a mandatory appreciation shift. They were marched down obsidian service ramps that wound through cathedral-like spaces of industry. The air here was a complex perfume of scorched ethics and distilled regret, overlaid with a thunderous rhythmic pounding that vibrated in the teeth. They emerged onto a gantry overlooking the primary refinement vat, the Gehenna caldera. It was a lake of swirling, multi-hued torment. Amber streams of remorse from Avernus Financial blended with the crimson rivers of rage from the fields of wrath, the sickly green, tributaries of envy from the pits of covetousness, and the thick, black sludge of pure hatred pumped from the deepest oubliettes. The cacophony was not of screams, but of a profound chemical wailing as the emotions reacted, bonded, and were torn apart under psychic heat. The drama here was one of brutal alchemy. Lesser demons, their bodies shielded by crusted carapaces of cooled slag, moved along the caldera's rim. They wielded immense, hooked poles, not to stir but to subdue. Clots of sentient suffering, a consolidated mass of 1,000 souls worth of betrayal, would sometimes rise to the surface, forming a screaming, many-faced membrane that sought to escape the melt. The pole demons would spear the mass, their hooks glowing white-hot, physically wrestled the weeping entity back under the surface, holding it down until it dissolved into the base solution with a final, boiling shriek. At specific junctures, the refined product was drawn off. Spigot of black iron, large enough to drive a chariot through, groaned open. From it, a viscous, shimmering silver liquid, not a metal, a liquidized consequence, poured into molds on a conveyor of damned souls, frozen in postures of endless toil. This was the currency of hell, sin shares, ingots of solidified cause, in defect, ready to be traded, hoarded, or invested in new infernal ventures. But not all harvest was so abstract. In a side chamber visible from the gantry, the more literal-minded refineries operated. This was the atelier of flesh and memory. Here, specialized artisans, demons with too many delicate fingers and magnifying lenses over their compound eyes, worked on individual souls deemed to possess particularly potent rare sins. A soul that had been a master manipulator, for instance, was suspended in a web of psychic filaments. The artisans carefully, almost lovingly, extracted specific memories, the exact moment a lie was believed, the flicker of trust in a victim's eye, and distilled them into vials of pure pitch-black deceit. A single drop could corrupt a minor blessing topside. A soul that had been a serial seducer was slowly rendered down, its capacity for false love crystallizing into razor-sharp pink diamonds that could shatter a mortal heart from a continent away. The blood here was feedstock. A chute dumped a load of screaming, still conscious souls from the crucible directly into a pulverizer, where they were not killed. Death was a mercy absent here, but broken into a slurry of base spiritual matter. This raw, screaming plasm was then piped into the vats to give body and volume to the more refined emotional extractions. It was the inert filler in Hell's economy, the dark matter that gave weight to its products. Alistair watched the refinery's heat blasting the numbness from his hollowed core. He saw his own daily quota, his 18 liters of amber remorse, flow into the caldera and vanish, a meaningless drop in an infinite ocean. The spark of resentment born in the cubicle farm found a new kind of fuel here, comprehension. His suffering wasn't just a punishment, it was a commodity. He and every other soul were live wells drilled into and pumped dry to feed this immense roaring machine. The pointless cruelty of his grind now had a point. And that point was profit for a system that stretched far beyond Overseer Malachor. A foreman demon, noticing the work gang's idle horror, decided their appreciation needed a tactile element. It forced them to the edge of the gantry and made them extend their hands over a vent releasing a gaseous byproduct, refined despair. The invisible fumes coated their skin, seeping in. For Alistair, it wasn't a vision of fire and brimstone. It was the absolute unshakable certainty that the machine was eternal, flawless, and that he was less than a cog. He was the fuel that had already been spent, yet was forced to keep burning. As they were marched back to the ramps, the thunder of the foundry fading behind them, Alistair's hand clenched. The cold hooked key in his chest felt different. No longer just a lock, but a tap. A tap in him, draining his essence into pipelines that led to forges and markets he could scarcely imagine. The grind had hollowed him. But the sight of the economy that fed on that hollowness filled him with something new. Something hot and dense and volatile. It filled him with a sense of ownership. If his pain was a currency, then he was being robbed. And in hell, the only thing more valuable than refined sin was the will to steal it back. The realization that he was fuel, not just a worker, sharpened Alistair's senses. He began to see the machinery of hell not as a monolithic force, but as a sprawling, dysfunctional organism riddled with factions. The politics of the damned were a subtle, brutal undercurrent beneath the official torments, fought not on battlefields but in ledgers, whispers, and sudden inexplicable reassignments. He witnessed his first true power play in the Avernus Financial Tortures Commissary, a vast hall that reeked of stale paste and quieter desperation. Overseer Malachor was ingratiating himself with a visiting arch-exactor from the Department of Mortal Corruptions, a sleek demon whose form shifted between that of a sharp-suited bureaucrat and a coiled serpent. Malachor's second mouth whispered not quotas, but flattery, promises of diverted resources. A few thousand extra liters of refined regret for my sector to lubricate your topside operations. In return, the arch-exactor's forked tongue flickered, suggesting a recategorization of a block of souls under Malachor's rival, an overseer in the neighboring pit of financial ruin. A simple clerical adjustment, shifting them from productive long-term despair to volatile. Imminent soul collapse would ruin the rival's quarterly yield metrics. The blood spilled here was professional, but its consequences would be visceral. Souls would be worked beyond their breaking point, shredded into raw plasm to make a rival's numbers look bad. But the true masters of this shadow war were the Internal Audit Legion. They were demons who had transcended mere cruelty, becoming incarnations of procedure. They moved in silence, their forms gray and indistinct, carrying scrolls of binding law that weighed more than anvils. When they entered a department, the ambient temperature dropped to a fearful chill. Alistair saw them descend upon the refinery foreman, who had subjected his work gang to the despair fumes. The Audit Legion did not accuse. They cited it. One gray demon unrolled the scroll, and the words slithered off the parchment, becoming cold. Hard chains of logic that wrapped around the foreman. Violation of Asset Preservation Code 667. Unauthorized exposure of designated labor units to Grade 3 existential contaminants, resulting in measurable depreciation of long-term suffering output. The foreman, a brute who had casually tossed screaming souls into pulverizers, now trembled. The Audit Legion's punishment was administrative erasure. A second demon produced a stamp that glowed with the cold light of absolute negation. It was pressed not to the foreman's flesh, but to his protocol of existence, the bureaucratic line that allowed him to be. With a sound like tearing reality, the foreman began to unspool, not into agony, but into non-being, his form dissolving into a mist of shredded paperwork and a faint echoing scream that was itself filed away in a subfolder. This was the ultimate threat, not the pit, but the file, to be deemed inefficient, redundant, or a liability to the infernal balance sheets was a fate worse than torment. It was deletion. Amidst this, Alistair felt the first tentative probe of a faction. A minor functionary from the Soul Reassignment Bureau, a demon with the perpetually harried look of a middle manager, sidled up to him at a paste dispenser. It didn't speak, but slipped a sliver of cold, mirror-like stone into Alistair's hand. When Alistair later gazed into it in the gloom of his niche, he didn't see his own reflection. He saw a rapid series of images, a secret ledger showing sin-share deficits in Malakor's department, a schematic of the pneumatic remorse pipeline, a glimpse of a quieter, less monitored sublevel where the piping was old and poorly maintained. It was an invitation, a test, a piece of illicit information offered by a cell of disgruntled mid-tier demons and advanced souls who sought not to overthrow hell, but to carve out a slightly better lot within it, to siphon off the raw product of suffering for their own benefit. To gain leverage, to survive the endless purges and power shifts, the drama here was in the silence, in the coded glance, in the sudden disappearance of a demon who had asked too many questions about resource allocation. The blood was often hidden, absorbed by the official records that listed a soul as reprocessed, or a demon as transferred to non-corporeal duties. Alistair clutched the mirror shard, its edges biting into his palm. The spark of resentment now had a map. The hollow feeling was replaced by a cold, calculating focus he recognized from his mortal life. This was a game of leverage, of hidden debts and stolen currency. He was still fuel, yes, but fuel could be diverted, fuel could explode. And in the labyrinthine politics of hell, a controlled explosion in the right place, at the right time, was not disaster, it was a promotion opportunity. He stared at the schematic of the pipeline, the path of his own harvested pain, and for the first time, he began to think not like a victim, nor a worker, but like a player. Even the engines of eternal punishment required lubrication. And the lubricant of choice for hell's middle managers and successful functionaries was the sanctioned, ritualized violence of the pit's leisure districts. This was recreational damnation, where the bureaucracy of suffering was set aside for the pure, artistic expression of cruelty. Alistair was summoned not by Malakor, but by the harried functionary from the Soul Reassignment Bureau. It was a test, a bonding exercise. They descended not into the industrial bowels, but into the glittering, cacophonous sinkhole known as the Carnivale of Lowered Inhibitions. The air here was thick with the scent of scorched sugar, spilled intoxicants, and adrenaline sweat. Phosphorescent fungi pulsed in time to a deep, arrhythmic pounding that vibrated in the marrow. Here, demons and senior damned indulged in distractions that refined their professional skills. The drama was not in quotas, but in flair. In the arena of ironic justice, souls who had been torturers in life were given phantom knives and set against projections of their own victims. The crowd, betting with sin-share chips, roared as the torturer souls were slowly, poetically dismembered by the very methods they had pioneered. Their agonized screams, a form of high art. At the gala of personal hells, attendees paid to Dan empathic leeches that allowed them to experience, as a fleeting titillation, the core torment of a designated soul. A demonic dandy might shudder with faux delight as he sampled 30 seconds of a soul's eternal claustrophobia. then laughingly order a glass of solidified screams from the bar. But the functionary led Alistair to a more exclusive venue, the Velvet Gash. It was a club where the entertainment was bureaucratic satire made flesh. On a stage of living, quivering fat, a performance was underway. A demon actor portraying a high-ranking internal auditor was being did himself by a troupe of souls dressed as lower clerks. They didn't whip him. They drowned him in paperwork, sealed his orifices with wax seals, and used abacus wires to slowly tally cuts into his hide. Each bead slid on the wire represented a budgetary shortfall, a real one, plucked from the day's gossip. The blood here was metaphorical, yet very real, and the audience of mid-tier managers howled with laughter. Their own professional anxieties exercised through the brutal caricature. This was where deals were made. In shadowed booths, overseers from different departments negotiated resource swaps, or conversations punctuated by the shrieks from the stage. The functionary, whose name was Kraz, pointed a taloned finger towards a private balcony. There, overseer Malachor was entertaining the sleek arch-exactor from corruptions. They weren't watching the show. Below their balcony was a private atelier of degradation, where a single luminous soul, a mortal artist damned for hubris, was suspended in a cage of focused spite. Malachor, with a magnanimous gesture, handed the arch-exactor a hooked tuning fork. The demon struck it, and the resonant frequency caused the soul's talent to manifest against its will. It began to paint exquisite portraits of its own mutilation on the inside of its cage with its own fluids. The arch-exactor smiled, a transaction of favor sealed not with a handshake, but with a shared act of exquisite, useless cruelty. This was the reward for compliance within the machine. Not rest, but the freedom to inflict suffering without a quota, to revel in the creativity of malice. It was a display of power, a demonstration that one had climbed high enough to make torment a hobby. For Alistair, the spectacle was an education. The spark of resentment he carried was met here with a roaring furnace of casual evil. He saw that the rebellion he contemplated was not against a blind system, but against creatures who enjoyed their work, who built their identities upon it. The blood on the stage, the artistic screams, the betting slips, it was all a celebration of the very economy that devoured him. Yet, in the laughter, he also saw a vulnerability. They were distracted. They were arrogant. Their recreational cruelty was a loop, an echo chamber. They watched parodies of audits, but never feared the real thing. They traded souls like currency, but forgot that currency could be counterfeited, stolen, or spent on a weapon. As a server imp offered him a goblet of swirling, conflicted emotions, the drink was called a crisis of conscience. Alistair declined. He met Kraz's expectant gaze and gave a slight calculated nod, not of enjoyment, but of understanding. He had passed the test. He had seen the pinnacle of infernal success and found it not dazzling, but hollow. And in that hollow place, his own resolve solidified, cold and hard and sharp as a shard of mirror. The game was not just about siphoning remorse. It was about learning the rituals, the distractions, and the profound recreational carelessness of his masters. Their fun was their blind spot. Alistair, who had forgotten how to smile, began to plan. The plan was not born of courage, but of a cold economic calculus. The spark of resentment had grown, fed on the hollow politics and recreational arrogance, into a ledger of its own. Alistair, with Kraz, the functionary, as his hesitant insider, had identified a single point of failure. A juncture in the pneumatic remorse pipeline where the flow from Avernus Financial met the main artery to the Gehenna caldera. The pressure there, according to stolen maintenance scrolls, was critical. The pipe itself was a relic, its integrity maintained not by engineering, but by a binding sigil that required a quarterly refresh, a task perpetually delayed by bureaucratic oversight. Alistair's rebellion was not a scream, but a silence. For 3 shifts, he deliberately underperformed. His amber droplets fell slow and thick, his psychic scalpel turned dull. He absorbed Malachor's silver probe punishments with a vacant stare, storing the surges of shame not to fuel his work, but to fuel his resolve. He was preparing for a withdrawal, not a deposit. On the 4th shift, as the department's collective hum reached its peak, he enacted his sole act of sabotage. He didn't attack a demon, he attacked a process. While feigning a malfunction at his station, he used a stolen sliver of psychic insulating, or a trinket from Kraz, to briefly, violently reverse the flow of his own remorse extractor. Instead of pulling pain from the soul on the pain, he focused every accumulated ounce of his own stolen anguish, his witnessed horrors, his calculated resentment, and projected it back into the machine. The feedback was instantaneous and catastrophic. Psychic shockwave, silent to the ear but deafening to the spirit, erupted from his cubicle. The obsidian pane shattered not into glass, but into solidified shards of the victim's sudden, unjustified hope. A profoundly toxic substance in this environment, the wave traveled up the extraction line, a contagion of wrongness. It hit the old, poorly sigilled junction at the precise moment the central pump cycled. With a sound like a dying god's sigh, the pipeline ruptured. It was not an explosion of fire, but of product. A geyser of pressurized, semi-refined remorse. Thousands of liters of concentrated golden agony erupted into the cavern of Avernus' financial tortures. The viscous fluid fell like a burning, sticky rain, drenching cubicles, machinery, and demons. The effect was not mere mess. It was metaphysical contamination. The liquid remorse acted as a corrosive solvent on the carefully constructed torments. Demons accustomed to inflicting suffering began to feel the accumulated weight of it, their professional detachment melting under the downpour. Souls in the extraction panes experienced a bizarre, fleeting moment of peace, seeing their tormentors writhe. Chaosis was an understatement. It was a system failure. Alarms long unused bleated in discordant pitches. Overseer Malachor, rushing from his observatory, slipped in a puddle of his own department's output and fell, his second mouth sputtering in incoherent fury. The blood was everywhere, but it was mixed, confused. Golden remorse swirled with the ichor of demons scalded by emotional feedback, and the silvery psychic blood of shattered monitoring spells. It was the first new color the gray cubicle farm had seen in eons. In the pandemonium, Alistair did not run. He stood amid the dripping wreckage, the insulating or growing hot in his hand. He had not won freedom. He had created a costly, embarrassing, and entirely traceable incident. Auditors would swarm. Scapegoats would be needed. But as he watched the flawless, monotonous hell of his daily grind dissolve into a screaming, sticky tableau of incompetence and unexpected sensation, he felt a profound, terrifying satisfaction. He had fought back, not with a weapon, but with a ledger error. Not against a demon, but against the flow. The upheaval was local and would likely be contained. But he had proven a theorem. The machine, for all its might, was fragile. Its greatest vulnerability was not an angry soul, but a patient, discontented accountant. As the first enforcers, their forms sharp and angry against the golden haze, descended on him with chains of interrogation, Alistair did not resist. He had made his entry in the books. The cost would be immense. But for the first time since the Crucible, the next chapter was not a predetermined torment. It was a negotiation. Alistair stood in a room of silent judgment. This was not a courtroom, but an administrative adjudication chamber, deep within the Internal Audit Legion's precinct. The walls were lined with shelves holding ossified screams, each one a former appeal that had been denied and filed away forever. The air was dry and scentless, a vacuum where hope itself died of exposure. Across a seamless obsidian slab sat 3 auditors. Their forms were indistinct, gray, and emanated a chill that seeped into the core of Alistair's spirit. They did not speak. Instead, words formed in the air between them, etched in cold blue flame, scrolled and annotated by unseen hands. Soul designate 8897 Delta. Violation, malfeasance, waste of soulful assets, unauthorized systemic disruption. Before them on the slab, hovering in a sickly light, was the entire incident of the rupture. Alistair watched his own actions replay, each moment weighed and measured. The cost analysis was excruciating. 18,000 liters greater remorse lost, 300 cubicle stations contaminated. Productivity in AV666 set back 2.8 eternal cycles. Collateral damage to inferior soul assets. 47 units, requiring recalibration. The presentation was immaculate, damning. The auditors did not look at him. They consulted deeper ledgers that flickered in the space above the slab. cross-referencing his case with precedents, quotas, and the shifting political winds. Then, a new line of text burned into the air, sourced from a footnote. Asset demonstrated. Initiative, systemic comprehension, resourcefulness, unauthorized. Prior to incident, consistent, if unexceptional, yield. Post-crucible assimilation, complete. Resistance factor. Negligible, isolated incident. This was the moment. Promotion, transfer, or the pit. The pit was simple deletion. Not torment, but unmaking. His essence would be rendered to base plasm, his identity scattered into the screaming slurry of the foundries. A footnote in an incident report. Transfer was a subtler doom. He could be sent to the soul-rending vats of the Gehenna caldera as a living component, forever drowning in the collective agony. Or to the frozen, silent trenches of despair mining, where hope was excavated from glaciers of forgotten dreams, a numb and frozen eternity. Promotion was the most perilous path. It meant acknowledging his disruptive capability was not a bug, but a feature. Hell had use for cunning, even rebellious cunning, if it could be aimed. It would mean a new brand, a new quota, an entry into the very managerial class whose hollow cruelty he had witnessed. The lead auditor's hand, a thing of bone and ghostly parchment, extended. From the air, it seemed to pluck three possibilities, making them manifest on the slab. First, a simple black orb, the pit, efficient, neat. Second, a twisted, shifting key, transfer, the oubliette of solipsism, eternal self-analysis. Third, a barbed sigil ring still hot from the forge, promotion, junior compliance officer, internal audit legion probationary. Assignment monitoring and reporting scholastic discontent in the Avernus financial sector. The ring was an exquisite trap. It would give him authority, a sliver of power, and bind him irrevocably to the system. He would be tasked with sniffing out sparks like his own, stamping them out before they could catch. He would become the very instrument that perpetuated the grind. It was a punishment dressed in privilege, a way to make his rebellion an asset to the bureaucracy. The auditors waited, their silence absolute. Alistair looked at the ring. He saw not power, but a more intricate cage. He saw Overseer Malicor's terror of the Audit Legion. He saw Craze's harried face in the crowd. He saw the rivers of refined sin and the pathetic roaring recreation of his masters. His hand did not shake as he reached out. He did not choose the pit, for that was surrender. He did not choose the transfer, for that was oblivion. He chose the ring. The moment his fingers touched it, the barbed metal grew hot and liquid, flowing over his hand, searing a new, complex sigil into his essence. It was a brand of ownership far deeper than the crucible's mark. It was a covenant. A cold, immense weight settled upon him. The weight of the ledgers, the protocols, the absolute law of hell. The auditors vanished. The chamber was empty. Alistair, now junior compliance officer, 8,897 Delta, stood alone. The drama was over. The blood had been mopped up, the costs tallied, the balance sheet corrected. He had fought the system, and the system, with infinite patience, had offered him a seat at the table. He looked down at his new hand, the sigil pulsing with a cold blue light. In the reflection of the obsidian slab, he saw not the terrified soul from the crucible, nor the hollowed worker from the cubicle. He saw a functionary. A part of the machine, he had escaped the grind. Now, his job was to ensure it ran forever, perfectly, and that any soul who tried what he had tried would be found, filed and extinguished. He turned and walked towards the door, his footsteps echoing in the silent chamber. The next shift was about to begin.